So I think if you hear the news headlines, it's easy to think that tobacco is quickly becoming a problem of the past. And according to the CDC, adult smoking rates have dropped to 15.5%. That was as of last year. And so that sounds really promising, and certainly we have made a ton of progress there. But I don't think it tells the full story because not all populations are declining at the same rate. Smoking's higher among those with less education, those living below the poverty level, those who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, individuals who identify with multiple races, people who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and those who have serious psychological distress. And so I think this group is well versed on the problems with that, but secondhand smoke contains more than 7,000 chemicals, and about 70 are known carcinogens. So if we can move to the next slide. There are about 80 million people living in the US. That's 1 in 4 Americans. So it's a significant population. And for some, this is a choice. And for many others, it's their only affordable option. So if we move to the next slide, there we go. So the issue with multi-unit housing is involuntary exposure. So it's estimated that about 2 in 5 children are exposed to secondhand smoke, and the CDC reports that the greatest exposure for children is in their own home. African American children receive nearly twice the exposure of other children, so about 7 in 10. Even though African American smoking rates are pretty comparable to those of other Americans. So clearly the secondhand smoke issue is one of social justice. In housing, smoke drifts through doors, windows, shared ventilation systems, lighting, electrical devices. There are many sources of smoke. I think another issue that sometimes people forget is just balconies, patios, because they're so close. Even if you aren't smoking in the home, if you're smoking outside, often that smoke is drifting, certainly to other people's balconies and patios, but also inside their homes. So we get a lot of questions about the sources of smoke, and we like to say that smoke is smoke. This is because ACS and ACS can regard all smoke equally, no matter the source. This has become a more recent issue because about 34 states, plus the District of Columbia, have passed laws permitting the use of marijuana. Sometimes that's only medicinal use, sometimes it's recreational use. But 13 of those states, along with DC, have included marijuana in their broad smoke-free protections. So there's sort of this new area being created with smoke-free issues because people aren't sure whether marijuana smoke should be included in secondhand smoke laws, or they just haven't gotten around to doing it. Several other jurisdictions have passed city or county ordinances, but few of those include housing in their policies. So we're hearing complaints from local residents about neighbors smoking marijuana, and the complaints have now become more prevalent than tobacco complaints. And certainly we hear both. There's similar issues with e-cigarette aerosols. And then of course, those are commonly the same thing because people are using e-cigarettes for marijuana. So without a smoke-free housing policy, the only recourse many residents have is to complain to management in hopes of getting a smoke-free policy or to move. And moving is not an option for a lot of people. It's costly, and there's nothing to say that the next residents won't have the same issue. So moving is not a solution, even though that is what many people end up doing. So in the next slide, oh, this looks very interesting on your end. It doesn't look that way on my end, but sorry. So I wanted to add a note about ventilation because a lot of people propose this as a solution, and that's really an industry tactic. They often argue that just ventilate the buildings and that will solve the problem. So the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRA, are the people who set the standards for ventilation, and they have long said that ventilation is not a solution. And I believe it was in 2010 that they first issued their statement saying the only way to assure a smoke-free environment is to eliminate smoking. Ventilation won't do that. They update their statements every couple of years, and in 2015, they added marijuana and e-cigarettes to the statement, and then they most recently updated it. I believe it was last year when it was most recently updated, 2018, and it remains the same, that no, ventilation is not a solution. So the next slide, great. So multi-unit housing takes many forms, comes in all sizes, and when we're working on the smoke-free policy for multi-unit housing, we define it as 2 or more units, and it doesn't matter whether it's owned or rented. And so a lot of times there's a lot of discussion about whether smoke-free housing should pertain to condos or owned units, and whether we can tell people what they can do inside their own home. We say that it doesn't matter whether it's owned or rented because everyone has the right to breathe clean air, whether they're renting or whether they've purchased their unit. So if we can go to the next slide. Great. So approximately 1/3 of residents are covered by a smoke-free policy, but about 80% of multi-unit housing residents have chosen to make their own homes smoke-free. So clearly, most people want a smoke-free environment, a smoke-free home. So property owners often question whether a smoke-free policy is a legal option and whether they can tell people what to do in their own homes. As I said, you know, whether it's rented or owned, and they sometimes think that the standards are different for the two. But again, nobody should have to sacrifice their health to have affordable housing. I'll add a note that property owners actually benefit from smoke-free policies. They have lower cleaning and rehab costs between tenants and lower insurance costs, but they continue to worry that vacancies will go up if they change the policy around smoking. So let's just go to the next slide here. Right. So smoke-free multi-unit housing policies take different forms across the country. And so in California, there are 56 jurisdictions with smoke-free multi-unit housing, and that's marketplace housing that we're talking about, not public housing. And California is the only state with jurisdictions that have passed smoke-free laws for marketplace housing. Most of those, so there are 56 that eliminate smoking in all units, but then another 18 that have partial protections, and those tend to be older policies. The more recent policies have been pretty thorough, pretty complete. It includes inside as well as patios and balconies. But we haven't seen that in any other part of the country, which is sort of interesting. And then the HUD law, which took effect in June of 18, was a great step toward protecting people in multi-unit housing, but it only pertains to publicly owned housing, which is only a small part of the subsidized housing, and that is a small part of multi-unit housing as a whole. And then the third category, which is really the most popular, is voluntary policies. And they're the easiest to pass, but they can be reversed, and enforcement can be inconsistent or unclear. And it really puts the enforcement on the property owner. That tends not to be a really difficult thing because usually it's in the lease, they post signs, and most people are compliant once they know what the rules are. In those policies, they can charge penalties, they can have a system where they have so many warnings and eventually evictions, but of course, nobody wants eviction to be the outcome of a smoke-free policy. They want a smoke-free environment to be the outcome. I will add that in California, where they've actually passed policies, the first couple received a lot of resistance, but now when we're working on policies in California, we often get the property owners association and the actual property owner or property manager who show up to speak in favor of the policy, because it kind of goes back to the enforcement piece. It shifts the onus from that entity to whatever the enforcement mechanism is within the policy. And so it's often code enforcement, just like a barking dog or trash or anything else that would be covered under your code enforcement. And so there are different enforcement mechanisms that can be written into the policy, but because it's no longer the property owner and because they've seen the benefits, most people want smoke-free housing. So instead of worrying about the vacancy rates, they actually see that people are looking for that because 85% of the country doesn't smoke. And then also the costs for them are lower. So usually now they're very supportive, but we haven't been able to really get that message out to the rest of the country. I think they're still sort of doubting that that is the way it works. So as far as trends, I think what we're seeing is progress continues, but it's slow. Health departments continue to receive smoking complaints, but more of those are now related to marijuana as marijuana has become legal in more jurisdictions. That tenants still want smoke-free housing, and perhaps more now than ever, because more people continue to make their homes smoke-free and to look for smoke-free housing. Health departments also get calls from tenants who are looking specifically for smoke-free housing, and not everybody keeps a database about which housing is smoke-free, and in areas where there aren't laws, it can be hard to let them know which of those areas are smoke-free. And then if they're voluntary policies, they're not really sure. Does that pertain to the entire complex? Is it only part of it? So it really goes back to the person who's shopping for housing. There's not a lot of assistance there. And then I guess, again, I want to end by saying where we have been able to pass policies in jurisdictions where they have actual smoke-free policies, not only do the tenants appreciate that, but the owners have come to support those as well. So that's what I have to say about it, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Thank you, Cassie. That's great. That's great. I have some questions because I always do, but before I ask mine, does anybody on the phone or on video have any questions? No one? If you are trying to talk, you're on mute. Okay. All right. Well, if you think of anything, guys, just put it in the chat and I will see it. Cassie, I was wondering about beyond housing, what do things look like region by region for smoke-free laws? So for instance, I'm in the Southeast and we are way behind on this sort of thing, but are things moving in a positive direction here? And what about the rest of the country?
Well, yes, I mean, as smoking rates drop and as people begin to become more familiar with the dangers of smoking, and I think that's been just a growing trend, and we can be really grateful for that because we have seen this steady decline in smoking over several decades now. So smoke-free laws continue to pass and expand. One of the areas that we are watching is preemption, which has started to show up in a lot of different places, and it's something that's promoted by the industry and a way that they can undo some smoke-free or tobacco laws. Some of that has happened with the passage of marijuana legalization. Then they start trying to undo some of these smoke-free laws for marijuana. And so that has become a new issue, but in general, the trend has been for smoke-free policies to expand, and you're right, they lag behind in the Southeast and in the center of the country.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And then what can we as individuals do? I mean, we're all doing this work every day, but I mean, is there one or two things that we can do to really help move things forward and support multi-unit housing, even if we don't live multi-unit housing, smoke-free policies?
Well, certainly if you live in multi-unit housing, it's really important to let the property manager or the building owner know that you want a smoke-free policy. I think the other thing is just to be aware that this is a legal option, so that if you're talking to somebody who lives in multi-unit housing or who happens to be a property manager, that they know that that's an option for them. You know, a voluntary policy is an option, even if their community isn't doing one. But again, we would love to see more communities doing that.
And my last question, I think there might be one question out there, but my last question is there a jurisdiction that you think is sort of the gold standard? And, would we be able to see the language that they use in their smoke-free policies?
Well, sure. I mean, there are several policies in California that have very similar, in fact, sort of the same exact language that has, as far as multi-unit housing. And so that would be the gold standard, except that it hasn't happened any place outside of that state. There is model language that was created by Change Lab Solutions, which is what they use there and have been using for quite a few years now. I think it's been about a decade since the first policy passed. And again, the first one received a lot of opposition, but the more recent ones do not. And so that's a really positive trend in that state.
That's great. Thank you. California leading the way in public health again. All right.
But I have this is Sharon. I have a question about does California have is there anything different about enforcement? Because I think that's what a lot of people object to when they start thinking about setting up rules about who can and can't smoke in their own home. They're worried about trying to enforce that. And what you've been talking about sounds more like people kind of having also almost the social norm that it's just not done here, rather than anything that's related to enforcement. Do you know if California has any strong enforcement policies?
No, that's a really good question. And you're right, that it really is more about social norms and setting those expectations. So when a policy is passed, they usually have a period of time for that to happen. So if it's passed in June, for example, they will say this will become effective January 1st. So they usually give them about 6 months. I've seen shorter and I've seen longer. I've seen as short as 30 days and as long as about a year and a half. But usually they try to give them several months, at which point they say any new lease will, and often starting in that phase-in period, they will say all new leases will include the language about it being a smoke-free building, and then renewals after the implementation date will also include that. So people have time, they're given resources for cessation. Some properties add a smoking area, but it has to be so many feet, usually between 25 and 50 feet from any common area, operable door or window, walkways. They try to make it someplace that other people won't be involuntarily exposed. You really have to go to that spot. And they often include the garage and the parking lot in the smoke-free policy, but that is an optional area. Not everyone does that. And so they try to contain that. So it's in the lease, and then there are also signs posted. And so it just becomes the norm. It's very rare that they need more enforcement than that, but it does happen. And then it's treated usually, and again, different jurisdictions choose their enforcement mechanism or enforcing body a little differently, but often it's through code enforcement. So it'd be the same as if you had a barking dog, that somebody from code enforcement comes out, they tell you they've heard the complaint, that you know, that this is a smoke-free policy or this smoke-free building, and then from there may be, and again, it's written a little differently every place, but there may be 3 warnings before there's a fine, or 2 warnings before there's a fine. From there might be multiple fines. Sometimes it can escalate to eviction, but because housing is very expensive in California, some people are in rent-protected housing, and this has passed in some rent-protected communities like San Francisco. They try to be mindful of that. And a lot of times the policies are even written so that there will not be eviction unless the fines are not paid, and then the fines escalate so that people have options other than losing their home. But it is primarily a social norm kind of enforcement.